Thank you for asking me back. On Saturday night, perhaps as many as 500,000 people demonstrated against the cuts. A day of protest and anger, mostly in good humour, gave way to an extraordinary mix in the evening of the still good-humoured, people out on a usual Saturday night in the West End, relatively small numbers of people out to cause trouble, and riot police lined across the street on each of the corners of St Martin in the Fields, trying to regain control of the city. The audience at the evening concert in church left by the side door so as to do so safely, but there had been a lot of noise during the concert, with shouting on the south side of the church in Duncannon Street through the music, as there had been during the student riots in November, when a near riot in Duncannon Street provided an extraordinary counterpoint for 550 of us listening prayerfully in church to Sir John Taverner's Towards Silence. On Sunday morning, we woke early to find the streets cleaned, Trafalgar Square empty, and only graffiti and a few placards as evidence of what was still in full flood when we went to bed in the small hours of the morning the night before. What happens to London after dark is, of course, that the day dawns and London begins again. I think we could all go home now. St Martin in the Fields is a church that was shaped out of the ministry of Dick Shepherd in the 20th century, the most famous of my 20th century predecessors. He became vicar in 1914, and since 1916, St Martin's has been known as the Church of the Ever-Open Door. It strikes me that that's a title that always risks disappointment, because it's very easy to turn up when it's closed, either because of a special service or because there's something else going on, or it's after hours. But there is something going on site 24 hours a day as the city goes on around us. St Martin's nowadays, like HSBC, calls itself the world's local church. St Martin's is, as Professor Cox said, the parish church of Buckingham Palace and Downing Street, as well as of many of London's homeless people. In an ordinary week, about 800 people come to regular church services that are the heartbeat of St Martin's, and we also host a considerable number of special services, which may be personal, like a Golden Wedding Thanksgiving or memorial service, parochial, like the annual service for a business headquartered in the parish, or of national or international significance, like the 50th anniversary of Amnesty International, which was an idea that came to the mind of its founder when he was sitting in the pews of St Martin's. These mean that about 80,000 people a year come to church services at St Martin's, and our congregations reflect the nature of London. We have services in English and Chinese. Our Cantonese-speaking congregation is nearly 50 years old, and a Mandarin-speaking congregation is growing nearly 7 years old. Within the English-speaking congregation, there are people with, at the last count, 14 different first languages. I think London as a whole has over 300, doesn't it? Extraordinarily cosmopolitan city. The church's mission statement is that St Martin in the Fields exists to honour God by being an open and inclusive church that enables people to question and discover for themselves the significance of Christianity. St Martin's is also a major tourist attraction, and as a point of principle, entry is free. That's a snub against St Paul's or Westminster Abbey, but they've got a different set of problems. But it makes me very angry indeed that my children have grown up within walking distance of both and say, it's not for the likes of me. In a commercial extension of the church's ministry of hospitality and welcome, our Cafe in the Crypt feeds 300,000 people a year, and something like 120,000 come to concerts at St Martin's. And that's more than St John Smith Square, which had one church service a year, which is what keeps them still a church and not just a concert venue. We're a sort of mix of free music at lunchtime and ticketed in the evenings on 3 or 4 nights a week. We also run a Chinese People's Day Centre and one of the largest centres for homeless people in Europe. In 2008, the Connection at St Martin's served just under 5,000 clients, and that number has grown by 600 in each of the last 2 years, and now stands at just over 6,000 clients a year. Unlike with the church, cafe and concerts, increased numbers coming through the door of the Connection is not a sign of success. We are there for people who have fallen through all the other safety nets of British society and find themselves unable to cope, gravitating to the centre of our capital city. 30% of our clients come from London, 30% from the rest of the UK, 20% from elsewhere in the European Union, and 20% from the rest of the world. We cannot work with everyone who presents themselves. The current form of that dilemma that has faced St Martin's from the beginning of its work with homeless people is that if someone does not have access to public benefits, there is very little that we can offer them apart from maintaining them with dignity by providing food and washing facilities. And the risk of that is these people get stuck in the centre of London and block up services which are otherwise there for people who can make use of them in order to move on and to gain or regain some sort of control over their lives. Our main aim is to help people pick themselves up, gain confidence and trust, so that they can move to sustainable lives, either by returning to where they came from or by moving into appropriate accommodation, which is likely to mean hostels or supported accommodation. We also have a programme in the Connection called Workspace to prepare people and help people to find employment. Last year, we helped 80 people find employment. That's a huge success. But remember the figure that we see over 6,000 people a year. And this in an economy where we're all meant to help people into work. Since the turn of the millennium, because of concerted efforts by government, the local authority and voluntary sector, it is claimed that there's been a 75% reduction in the number of rough sleepers in London, even more across the country. Now, those numbers are disputed. Defining homelessness, defining who is homeless, is a curiously difficult thing to do. It sounds such an easy, single-issue thing, but it's not at all. But everybody agrees that there has been a huge reduction in street homelessness since the turn of the millennium because of this concerted focus led by government and the local authorities and partnered with the voluntary sector organisations that work with homeless people. It's been a really, really constructive and impressive thing. And Westminster City Council have been leading players in that partnership. Last Thursday there was a street count. I think this happens each quarter, and it's a way of trying to sort of track what's happening to people who are sleeping rough at the moment. And within Westminster there were 82 rough sleepers last Thursday night. That's people out on the streets, lying down, and in addition you'd have to add to that, to get the sort of figure that I think is nearer accurate, 25 other people who are what are called A8s from Romania, and that part of the EU which cannot claim benefits and therefore don't have recourse to public benefits in this country at the moment. And then there were 37 more in our night centre, which has a capacity of 40. So if you add those figures together, 82 plus 25, 107, plus 48, I'm doing it myself, doing it at the figures I came at, plus 48, 107 plus 48, 156, 155, is that right? 155. So I think that gets a sort of realistic sort of figure. But at the turn of the millennium, the similar sort of comparison would have been a bit over 600. So it is a huge reduction that has taken place. It's very, very impressive. The aim of reducing the number of rough sleepers in London to 0, which is what the stated policy is, I think was always unrealistic. I've always worried a great deal about it, because if you say we're going to reduce the number to 0, it seems to me that you start with a big voluntary effort, and then you begin to enforce and compel and start to use a stick rather than a carrot. The problem with it is that there are always new people arriving. So there might only be a few hundred across London sleeping on the streets tonight, but there are some thousands of people coming into the system each year. Not 6,000. Not all the people we see through the connection are actually rough sleepers at the moment, or have been rough sleeping. But homelessness is wider than that, and the issues connected with homelessness are wider than that. Addiction, mental health, poverty, family breakdown, unemployment, and so on. So it's a rather wider mix that we see through our centre. But if you think about some probably 2,500 people coming into London, maybe from the outer London boroughs, maybe from elsewhere in the UK, but as I say, from all over Europe and around the world now, then this is not a static population, and it's always been unreasonable to set a target of 0 tolerance. And it seems to me that rather like Westminster gets the benefit of the parking income from being at the centre of the capital city, so it has to pick up some of the cost of what it is to be the capital city and who gravitates here. Much more realistic is the Mayor of London's strategy, which I think is a really well thought through one, of no second night on the streets. It's a strategy of early intervention, so that people don't become entrenched rough sleepers. It's so easy to get into a culture where it's all right on the streets, I'm all right, but actually it's not. It's dangerous, your health suffers, it's not a safe place to be, but also it's a place in which people's mental health deteriorates and where addiction becomes more prevalent. And this is not a great option, and people know that. It's not something people make as a lifestyle choice. Having said that, I and the connection at St Martin's are not wholly opposed to coercion, and we accept that we have to limit access to our services in order to be effective in what we do. The organisations working across the homelessness sector offer what I think is a version of tough love, which is realistic, working with one aspect of what might be described as the dark side of this vibrant, creative, affluent, world-class city. For the last 11 years, Westminster City Council has led in creating the partnerships that have served so well and produced such significant successes. So can you banish this dark side? It was really quite an extraordinary thing that, without any prior consultation that I'm aware of, Westminster City Council began a public consultation which ended last Friday, proposing a new bylaw for good rule and government for the prevention and suppression of nuisances. They propose to criminalise lying down and sleeping in a public place, or putting down any materials used or intended to be used as bedding in or on any public place. This draft bylaw would also have criminalised the distribution of free refreshments in or on any public place, or knowingly to permit any person to distribute any free refreshment in or on any public place. There were exemptions about the distribution of free refreshments. Of course, the proposed bylaw would not apply, A, to persons taking part in a sporting event, B, on any premises on which there is in force a premises licence, C, if the distribution is of samples of refreshment and is carried out for marketing purposes on land adjacent to retail premises in which the same refreshments are available for sale, and D, by the council or any health authority or any person acting on behalf of the council or any health authority exercising powers to protect public health. Any person offending against these bylaws would be liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding level 2 on the standard scale, which I think means a fine of up to £500. It does seem odd to threaten a homeless person with a fine of up to £500, as it is odd to criminalise people for providing food to poor people. Well, I'm glad to say there has been uproar, and it was reported at the end of last week that the leader of the House of Commons, Sir George Young, said on Thursday to the shadow leader Hilary Benn that Westminster are going to adopt a, quotes, more enlightened approach and not legislate about the reduction of rough sleeping and soup runs, but will consult in order to seek a continued reduction. If so, and I don't think Westminster have yet said anything, that will be the right outcome. But this consultation has strained relations between organisations that are and need to be partners. One of the lessons is that you cannot banish the dark side. Those who are homeless would not have gone away. Instead of criminalising homeless people, it would be better to ask what we can learn from them, to understand their experience of how and why they became homeless, and to help them to take greater responsibility for themselves. I think one of my favourite stories from the whole of my time at St Martin's was shortly after the turn of the millennium, and there were a group of very entrenched rough sleepers at the back of the Savoy Hotel, and the police said, "We've got a problem." The local authority said, "We've got a problem." The hotels said, "We've got a problem and we really don't know what to do about it." So we asked the homeless people what they thought, and they said, "Well, we've got a problem too." And we put them all in a room together. And what was really interesting was, although they saw the problem from different angles, it was all basically the same problem. And it was quite easy to develop strategies that reduced the number of soup runs, because the homeless people said, "You know, it really doesn't work for us being woken 7 times a night by people who, to start with, you're pleased with the first one, but after that, and they sort of fail to wake you up, and they push the sandwiches under your head, and you wake up and find a rat eating the sandwiches by your head. We actually think there's something going wrong here, and it's not helpful." And of course, the real problem was that these people wanted to be found accommodation and to be supported out of homelessness. So I think it's best if we acknowledge the dark side and try to learn from it and respond to it. I've called this section Night Walks because I think they're so instructive in acknowledging the dark side. I said that the greatest of my 20th century predecessors was Dick Sheppard, and before he became Vicar of St Martin in the Fields, he spent a night out on the streets. He wanted to know the parish, what it was like at all times of the day and night. And you just have to think about London now to get the feel for this. The sense in which in the early morning, when I wake up, Trafalgar Square's empty. 3, 4, 5 people at the most. And then when the commuter trains start coming in through Charing Cross, there's a flow of people like a river, and it's a really strong river that's difficult to cross if you're going in a different direction. And then it settles down to visitors. And then in the early evening, after people have gone back in a reverse direction to Charing Cross, and people are hanging around in the pubs and bars and cafes, and you can feel the optimism of a good night out. And then people head off to where they're going, and it quietens a little. And then the theatres pour out, and most people are heading back to trains, and a few people stay, and the youngsters are coming in to go clubbing. And there's still a great sense of optimism until about 11:15. And by then people have started to have drunk too much. A good night has turned into something where there are rows going on the streets. And it sort of tips over into something quite unpleasant, where people pee against our front door. And you know, that whole sense of the West End becoming a public urinal. It's familiar, but it's not pleasant. And then it quietens down again, and the youngsters come through at 2 or 3 in the morning and get the night buses and head off for home. It's got such different characters. Well, Dick Shepherd watched this for 24 hours, and I'm sure it looked a bit different, but I bet it didn't look that different. And what's interesting is it's out of this experience, this sense of really paying attention to London right through the cycle of the 24 hours, that he's able to form a vision for St Martin's, which is still the vision that informs us and inspires us. He said, "I saw a great church standing in the greatest square of the greatest city in the world, and I saw on the west steps, and I saw what this church stood on the west steps, and I saw what this church would be to the life of the people. There passed me into its warm inside hundreds and hundreds of all sorts of people, going up into the temple of their Lord with all their difficulties, trials and sorrows. I saw it full of people dropping in at all hours of the day and night. It was never dark. It was lighted all night and all day. And often, tired bits of humanity swept in. And I said to them as they passed, 'Where are you going?' And they said, 'Only one thing. This is our home. This is where we are going to learn of the love of Jesus Christ. This is the altar of our Lord, where all peace lies. This is St Martin's.'" It's a great romantic vision, but it's got force, hasn't it? It's still got force. And it comes out of that sense of paying attention to the dark side of the city, not just to the light. Most of us are not inquisitive enough, or are too frightened to befriend the dark side of the city and of ourselves, which is so easy to misread. I think that's why we're frightened of it. The sculptor Josefina de Vasconcelos, who died in 2005, aged 100, she used to work in the crypt of St Martin's in the 1950s, in one of the old burial vaults. In old age, she told me she was the most remarkable woman. I think I could do a lecture about Josefina by herself, but it would just be a series of anecdotes. But in old age, she told me that in the 1950s, at the end of her working day, sort of, 6, 7 o'clock, something like that, she was cleaning up in the toilets, and the ladies of the night were coming in and putting on their makeup and getting ready to go out to start their night's work. And one of them said to Josefina, "What do you do?" So Josefina explained that she was a sculptor, and she made things, and it was really beautiful, and she got very enthusiastic as she did. And this woman looked at her and said, "Well, you know what you are?" She said, and this is the title that Josefina would have liked to have given the autobiography of the book she never wrote. "You know what you are? You're a good tart wasted." Well, she wasn't. She was a great sculptor, fulfilled. But it's so easy to misread the dark side of our natures and our city. And the fear of the night is the fear that the dark can overwhelm us and that the day won't dawn. I loved discovering last week that Charles Dickens was a great night walker of London. I mean, being a night walker is a risky occupation, isn't it? I do it a lot. And it seems to me, there's the Jekyll and Hyde, there's the Jack the Ripper, there's that side which, we just don't want to get caught up in. And there's this wonderful Dickensian sense of Charles Dickens loving to walk from his rooms in Covent Garden after business hours, or on a Saturday, or better still on a Sunday, into the city of London and roam its deserted nooks and corners. He wrote an essay in 1860 called Night Walks, which begins, "Some years ago, a temporary inability to sleep, referable to a distressing impression," I'd love to know what that was, "caused me to walk about the streets all night for a series of several nights." He goes on, "From midnight till dawn, as a cure for his distress, I finished my education in a fair amateur experience of houselessness. Walking the streets under the pattering rain, houselessness would walk and walk and walk, seeing nothing but the interminable tangle of streets, save at a corner, here and there, two policemen in conversation, or the sergeant or inspector looking after his men. Now and then in the night, but rarely, houselessness would become aware of a furtive head peering out of a doorway a few yards before him, and coming up with the head would find a man standing bolt upright to keep within the doorway's shadow, and evidently intent on no particular service to society. The wild moon and clouds were as restless as an evil conscience in a tumbled bed, and the very shadow of the immensity of London seemed to lie oppressively upon the river. I read something else later, 1880s, which described Trafalgar Square as having over 800 homeless people sleeping in it each night. Dickens befriended those lonely streets as he did graveyards and what he called shy neighbourhoods. And because he did so, he was able to describe it vividly and distinguish between lovable rogues and real wickedness. His novels are deeply moral tales. And then I discovered this general prayer for charity, which the Dean of Westminster Abbey used recently. It's beautifully turned. Make us, O Lord, remember that it is Christianity to do good always, even to those who do evil to us, to love our neighbour as ourselves, and to do to all men as we would have them do to us. Indeed, Manuela, but this is Dickens, and we've got to forgive him, and I want to keep his language, but of course he means men and women, of course he does. And do to all men as we would have them do to us. To be gentle, merciful and forgiving, and to keep those qualities quiet in our own hearts, and never make a boast of them, but always to show that we love thee by humbly trying to do the right in everything, that thus remembering the life and lessons of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to try and act up to them, we may confidently hope that thou wilt forgive us our sins, and mistake and enable us to live and to die in peace, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It's beautiful, isn't it? If you want a copy of it, it'll be in my book of prayers for the National Gallery that comes out next July. The Art of Worship, Yale University Press, £14.99. I often walk at night, as I said. Last Thursday night, I went out for a walk with one of our outreach team from the Connection at St Martin's to see with them what's going on with rough sleeping. It was early. We went out from 8:30 to 10:30. And I was surprised how few rough sleepers we met, though the numbers, of course, became larger as the evening went on. And there were those men standing in doorways in shadows who were extraordinarily invisible. And one of the things that always shocks me when I go out on these sorts of journeys with really experienced eyes and professionals who know what they're looking for, I'm always shocked. Not how visible rough sleeping is in London, but how invisible. Once you get an eye for it, once you start looking, once you know where to look, there's much more than meets the eye. The conversations with this outreach worker I thought were really impressive. She focused on the needs of the individuals. They were structured conversations, they were responsive conversations, they were persistent conversations. We can offer you more than you think, she'd say. It's not safe to be on the streets. One man told us about his shoes being stolen from underneath his head whilst he was sleeping. And because they were tucked under his head, he felt them go and jolted, and he ran off after the person down the road who had just stolen a £5 pair of trainers and would have left this man without shoes, just as a jape, just for fun. Unfortunately, he chased off down them and got them back. But it's an indication that it's not safe. She said, we can link you to the place where you've come from, in this case, an outer London borough. Things aren't as they seem, not just at St Martin's, but with homeless people in general. A young woman in a cardboard box just across the road and behind the building from the Opera House. has at least one and probably two places that she owns. 4 men on the steps of the Theatre Royal knew me from coming into church. We're the well-behaved ones, they said. And from my point of view, they are. I really like them. The outreach worker said that the trouble is, from her point of view, they're not the well-behaved ones. One story doesn't add up, and there's something undeclared about him. We've helped him into accommodation 3 times, she told him, and it's worked for a while, 6 months, a few weeks, a few days. But then it breaks down and he disappears and goes to ground, and we don't see him for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. And until he is willing to own up to whatever it is, presumably an addiction, that tips him out of this accommodation, there's nothing we can do that will help him into accommodation. The other 3 were drinkers, though one's been dry for a few months and seems to be on the edge of being able to get back and into work, which for him is running a bar. And that's what got him into trouble before. Some people we couldn't help. A man in his 50s or early 60s from Lithuania, who had been helped home a year ago and has come back recently. We can do nothing to help him, except have a friendly, firm conversation. Why did you come back? Because there's nothing for me there. Whatever happens here, it's better than being in wherever he's from. Or a Chinese man who has no identity, and no one will take responsibility for him. Immigration cases are complex, and some people just get lost in the system. It is complex. I've no idea why this man has no papers and why nobody can work out who he is. Almost certainly, he's actually making it difficult for them to trace him and doesn't want it, because I imagine he would then be deported. But he's determined to keep this status, but it means nobody can do anything to help him. When we open church at 7:30 every morning for the last few months, I suppose since just before the very cold snap in December, about 30, some days 40, the most 45, mostly men, come into church. They fall asleep very quickly. One of them snores very loudly. They have all been out, or they've mostly been out all night. One travels on the night buses. Others gamble. That's a way of staying in noble amusements. I suppose they gamble partly because it's light and warm and safe, and also because they hope they'll win. But I can tell you they never do. Others have tried to bed down, and they get moved on every 2 hours. There seems to be a policy among the police and perhaps among others to wake them up and disturb them. Some of them are unable to access the services for homeless people because they don't have recourse to benefits, as I've said. And these are some of the people who depend on food handouts from what are called soup runs, though there is agreement that there's over-provision for the numbers in these circumstances. So this business of the dark side and how it is, it's worth trying to explore and to think about doing so in some different ways. About a year ago, when I agreed to give this lecture, there was a large black steel box in the turbine hall at Tate Modern. Do you remember it? Some of you might have seen it. It was called How It Is by the Polish sculptor Miroslav Balka. This giant structure with a vast dark chamber reflected the surrounding architecture, almost as if the interior space of the turbine hall had been turned inside out. It stood on 2-metre stilts, was 13 metres high, and 20 metres long. It was huge. Visitors could walk underneath it and hear the echoing sound of footsteps on steel, or enter via a ramp into a pitch-black interior. I suppose it would be like here if we turned the lights off. It's very tempting to try. And what it was meant to do was to create a sense of unease. The Tate said Miroslav Balka's box of darkness is disturbing in its historical echoes, but beautiful as well. The Times said that Balka's black hole is terrifying, awe-inspiring and thought-provoking. The Guardian said it embraces you with a velvet chill. I thought it was fabulous and a really fascinating idea, but exceptionally difficult to create. There were anxieties at Tate Modern about health and safety, and it was disorientating to enter the black box. It needed patience, because after a few minutes, your eyes adjusted, and it was possible to see just a little in the darkness. Even so, the relief of reaching the back wall and of turning back and facing the light and seeing other people coming towards you making the same journey was extraordinary. People stayed silently waiting in what I thought was comfortable rather than threatening darkness. I'm a vicar, so I had anticipated that people would help each other. You know, you'd bump into somebody and they'd take your hand and they'd help you along. And the land of the blind, the man with one eye is king, and all of that. Not a bit of it. It was shocking how individualistic we all were, disappointing to me. At least on the occasion that I was there. And people didn't help each other and kept to themselves. Perhaps that's an indication of the fear and the isolation of darkness, and a real indicator of how it is. St. Seraphim of Sarov, one wonderful Russian mystic, end of the 18th, early 19th century, said, "The darker the night, the brighter the stars." In the darkness, you can see the points of real hope. So I want to say something about spirituality and the dark side. Churches make good use of light and dark. The epistle from the Book of Common Prayer at 8 a.m. Holy Communion yesterday morning after I'd come in after the riots ended, this is from the epistle to the Ephesians, "Awake, thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light." It's a great declaration. St. John's Gospel in particular speaks of Christ as the light of the world. Its great prologue asserts that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Early on Easter morning, just before dawn, in churches up and down the country, small groups of people will gather in the dark for the vigil of readings, telling of our salvation history according to the scriptures. As the dawn nears at St. Martin's, we'll go out onto the church portico and light a new fire outside the church before coming back in carrying the Easter candle. It's amazing how much light a solitary flame gives, and how much joy is spread when that light is spread around the church by those gathered lighting candles and passing the light around between them. Light and dark is powerfully symbolic for religion. In church yesterday, it was the third Sunday in Lent. At St. Martin's, we've got a series of sermons in Lent at the 10 a.m. Eucharist by one of my colleagues, by the clergy, and at 6:30 by lay members of the church congregation, Exploring the first verse of Psalm 130, out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my prayer. And at 6:30 so far we've heard about grief, pain, and refugees. One of the emerging themes is the psychological insight that what we do not acknowledge about ourselves will not go away. You can't banish the dark side, and will create an undertow that becomes ever more difficult to suppress. Here's what Philippa Smethurst, a counsellor and psychotherapist, said the Sunday night before last. People who embark on psychotherapy or counselling are troubled in some way that they find difficult in understanding or changing by themselves. So either willingly or unwillingly, they embark on a process of exploration which involves descent down into the depths. Seeing things more clearly can be a relief, an illumination, and bring a sense of space and lead to greater creativity. But the process of uncovering these feelings and truthful things can feel extremely frightening for a person and like something that should be resisted at all costs. Most of us manage to get through our lives without psychotherapy and counselling. Many of us don't, but all of us are pretty good at avoidance of those things out of the depths. We create displacement activities. We find things that somehow dull the pain or desensitize us. And the trouble is that that's not great, because this isn't going to go away. And the displacement activities are not going to produce some sort of resolution and solution. Some say, of course, that's exactly what religion is. I disagree. Well, there's a surprise. And I think that to be human is to be religious. We can't avoid the sense of wonder and that there's more to life than meets the eye. The whole experience of Lent is about us standing truthfully, honestly, before God in the desert, as it were. In what is common wisdom, Christianity identifies truth and love, much as the Greeks identified goodness and truth. Good religion, good spirituality has to address our whole human nature, the dark side and the light. And therefore churches cannot afford to address only the day. Some services are required to take place in daylight, a wedding, for example, where there must be no risk of deception. But we know that nighttime services have a stillness and a focus quite different to anything that can be achieved in the daylight. One of the things that has caught my attention recently is that in the Scandinavian cities, the churches have been developing something called night church. And they've realized that because of the different rhythms of the city, it really won't do to just close the church door at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock and just let the city wash on by. And so what they've started to do, first in Oslo and Helsinki and Stockholm and Copenhagen, but now rather more widely in towns and cities, is to have some churches that are open through the evening, not usually right through the night, because I think the city does change its character and it becomes more difficult and people become more vulnerable. But to run things through the evening, which are where a group of churches might gather together, as in Copenhagen, where 3 churches do this, on Thursday and Friday and Sunday evenings from 8 through till midnight. And they might do things which are quite traditional and structured, or they might just provide a space where people can come to be still, or to have a conversation, or to drink coffee, or light candles. And then within that, to have a pattern of services, or music, or prayer, which help to focus people and to still them, and to help them have a good end to their night out, rather than for it to fall apart in the way that it does for so many. There's structure, space, conversation. And as well as worship, there's a lot of room and an emphasis on providing opportunities for speaking with the pastor. They have specialist teams of pastors for this work, and they've built up a team's experience over 10 or 12 years doing this. One of the churches in Copenhagen has also developed a team of street pastors, an idea which has begun to develop in London, mostly out of evangelical churches, but out of a care for the city and the people of the city by night. The Danish minister in London, Elsa Hud, told me that she described what was called Job's Corner, a place where people leave their lamentations. They also have a prayer box, and at the last service of the evening, the prayers from the box are read by the pastor. We've had a few experiments in that direction at St Martin's, but London's a great deal bigger and more difficult than any of the Scandinavian cities. But when we've been open as part of something else, it's been really successful. A late concert for some, works for some. A late night arts talk about an installation in Trafalgar Square attracted very few. On the night that thousands gathered in London, was it at the turn of the millennium, to make poverty history, the church was packed for a service, and then for 2 hours of prayers that followed. And the cafe in the crypt had sold out in the small hours of the morning, and people had to go out to a 24-hour supermarket to restock. We'll continue to test those sorts of ideas, because I'm really sure that this Scandinavian experience has got something for London. In some places, night church ends with Holy Communion. Perhaps that's the rather obvious and conventional conclusion to this talk about spirituality and the dark side. It's there in the foundational story which gathers Christians today, week by week and day by day. On the night that he was betrayed, Jesus had supper with his friends, and taking bread and wine, he gave thanks to God, saying, "This is my body, this is my blood. Do this in memory of me." It is the way of the cross. There is no darker side. And it is the way to Easter and to the light of the new dawn and resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas. Nicholas Holtam has agreed to spend the next 10 minutes or so asking questions or listening to comments. And you can only do this if you attract my attention and get a microphone. So is someone going to start? I can't see. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you need a microphone, yes.
Yeah. I eat in St Martin in the field, and I just wondered, was the profits that you get from the food, does it go to the homeless direct, or does it go to the church?
It doesn't go to the homeless direct. It's a very clever mix. St Martin Fields, I think I said, we don't have an endowment, so we do depend on earning money from the business in order to pay for the whole thing. And therefore, the work with homeless people takes place in a large building, which we gathered all of our work above ground and into light when we did the renewal project. And there's a very small licence fee on that building. It's not a commercial rent or anything like that. So we're providing the space in which this work can take place. And then we're also providing the space in which we're able to fundraise for the connection. Things like the BBC Radio 4 Christmas Appeal and so on, which are I think, miracles, really, in British public life, where we were able to raise, this year, £1.5 million for our work with homeless people and with people in need all over the country. So the cafe in the crypt and the concerts are the way in which we make the money, which sustains the whole. And there's an indirect relationship to supporting our work with homeless people. But I think it's a very clever mix. It's not my invention, it was my predecessors, of church, charity and business working together to create a sustainable community. So I'm very glad that you eat in the cafe in the crypt, and I would encourage all of you to do so.
So I wonder, it will come from behind, sir. If you turn around, you...
Thank you. You referred to Charles Dickens, going for walks at night. It's also said that Prime Minister Gladstone used to walk, walk out of his residence and try and talk ladies of the night, to a more respectable life. Now, do you consider that good Christian practice, which can be used in today's world, or do you think that was a little excessive?
Well, it's not an area that I know as well as I know homelessness. So I think that's why I haven't talked about it. I did wonder about that, because it is such an evident feature of the West End of London. The essay in which I read about Charles Dickens said that at the same time there were probably something like 50,000 prostitutes working in London in the 1860s. 50,000!
3 times the men used them.
That's probably true. But there's a side of life which is not really acknowledged in our public discourse. Now, the numbers will be very different, and what we know about prostitution and the sex trade now is it's tied up with human trafficking, with people who are coming pretty much as slave labour. And there is a very deep and dark side to this, which the only occasion that I think I've got close to it, I realised it was how very violent and dangerous it is. And therefore, I think good intentions will not be enough in addressing this sort of area, nor will it be enough just to try to ban it. This is not going to go away, as it were. But the task is somehow, I think, to find whatever the analogous processes that I've been able to describe in relation to homelessness. Here's something that we don't want. We don't want it for anybody. And yet it exists, and we need to understand it and to listen to people in order to find out what we can do more constructively with it. So I think the little I know in this area says this is a violent world and a dangerous one, and not one to be, just to be done out of individual kindness and goodwill. I think it's much more serious than that.
Gentlemen.
Nick, one of the issues for the connection is the circumstances in which clothes are given away or sold, and there's never a simple answer to that. It just reminded me of that one of Dickens' walks was actually walking up Whitehall and seeing on the steps of St Martin's a pile of clothing. And Dickens describes it, as you would expect, beautifully, in that the pile of clothing, in fact, is a person, and it stands up and walks away, wraith-like. I was just wondering if by any chance you had met anybody on the steps who you didn't expect to meet.
I think it needs to be explained that Roger, who asked the question, used to be the director of our social care unit, and therefore knows far more about this than I do. And one of the things I love about ever speaking as the Vicar of St Martin-in-the-Fields is there are always people in the audience who know much more about whatever it is you're talking about. I'm buying myself time, aren't I? Well, on the day I came to be interviewed to be Vicar of St Martin-in-the-Fields, in, I suppose it was May 1995, somewhere around then, there were a pile of shoes. One shoe representing 1,000 people who had been killed in the genocide of Rwanda. There were 800 shoes there. It was one of the most shocking sights that I have ever seen. 800 shoes representing 800,000 people so visibly and graphically at the heart of London on the steps of St Martin's. So we can use the steps of St Martin's to tell a story about what it is to be the world's local church, and to try to hold the truth before ourselves, which is so uncomfortable, and each other, and stay with it. Last night, in this series of talks at 6:30, the chairman of the Refugee Council talked about the experience of refugees in this country. We all think Britain's overrun with refugees. That's the common discourse. 2% of the world's refugees come to this country, 2%. And of course, the largest number of refugees go to the developing world and to the countries that are least able and the poorest to cope with them. Now, these truths are incredibly difficult for us to face, but it seems to me that that's part of the Christian responsibility to try to do it, and the steps of St. Martin's are one of the places in which it's done. That said, friends of mine got engaged on the steps of St. Martin's, and all sorts of other things, celebrations and happy things happen there too. But they're a really useful public face for this church.
Yes, another night walker in London, of course, was Rudyard Kipling, who, as a young man, was in Diggs in Villiers Street, so he would have known your area very well. And one of his recurring themes was the city of dreadful night. And in fact, from a very early age, even when he was in India, he had long bouts of insomnia and would wander around composing his wonderful stories and poems. What I was thinking about with this particular question isn't so much the destitute as the changes to working practice in London. People are expected to stay much longer in the office than was considered normal even 20 years ago, and we are seeing a significant rise in offices and services which are open for 24 hours a day. Have you seen any change in the sort of pattern of work that you do that reflects the working population of the central London?
That's such an interesting question. I was filling in my census form yesterday, and it asked how many hours I worked, and it gave a range, the top one being over 49. One of my colleagues said to me this morning, "Did you do your census form yesterday? Aren't they utterly unrealistic about how much we work?" Clergy typically clergy typically work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. We're not alone. The partner of the colleague the husband of the colleague who asked me, who works in the film industry, he too commented and said, "This is ridiculous. We all work longer hours than that." Now, this is really bad news. Firstly, because legislation's become detached from reality. The reason the question is framed in the way it is because there is a limit to how many hours we're supposed to work. But my guess is people in jobs are working harder than ever, at a point at which unemployment is rising very fast, and people out of work can't get in. Now, what's going on in that? And that's a dilemma that I first heard Charles Handy frame probably 25 years ago. So that's, I think, got more extreme. And then we don't go to sleep now, do we? Not because we're night walkers, but we're night workers. And the city, the lights are left on, not just because the offices are empty and there are cheap lighting systems where it's more expensive to turn them off and then turn them back on, which is when they use the energy, but because there are people there talking to Hong Kong or to New York or to Sydney. And this global culture in which we live and work means that it's a 24-hour city. So the combination of working longer hours and working hours which no longer allow us to meet one another socially in the same way that we, I think, used to, means that there's a real problem for us. And the way we've got round it is, well, I think two ways. One is we live on networks, people like us, so we become tribal, in effect. And then we've also got round it by virtual communication, talking to each other on Facebook or Twitter, both of which I have a high regard for and think they've got a real place in our communications. But the dark side of both of those is increasingly apparent when people get caught out and faced and something's brought to light that they would rather not have brought into a real day, where you see things happen. And so they're the anxieties about it. We get disconnected from the reality. And I think those are the dangers of this sort of 24-hour culture and of the way in which we're working. But I realise I'm also showing my age and that younger people might feel much more positive about it.
We'll be rapidly approaching 2 o'clock. One last question. You've been very patient.
Thank you. Why are you laughing?
Because I couldn't see who was asking the question, and then I recognised the voice.
Okay. To what extent can homeless people lead the prayers? How can they get involved? Can you somehow tap into this? No, more than that. They obviously have a right, don't they, to worship and to perhaps lead it and to get involved.
Well, that of course does happen. Two examples. We broadcast on Christmas morning on Radio 4, and one of the the broadcast got a very strong response for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that got a response to me was the two homeless men from my colleague's spirituality group at the Connection who talked about the experience of homelessness. And one of them was able to say, actually, and I've never ever thought of this, I've often said the shepherds on the hillside outside Bethlehem are the sort of the second-hand car dealers of their day, I've said, rather smug with the illustration, because as people on the hillsides, they weren't able to keep the rules of ritual purity. They were the outsiders of Jewish society. They weren't to be trusted. But Walter said that the story of the birth of Jesus was told by the angels first to rough sleepers. What a brilliant insight. Well, it's exactly what Luke is trying to tell us, that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, is made known to outsiders and to the people who were sort of disregarded. I thought it was a brilliant insight. So there, two homeless men had an audience of about 1.5 million in an act of worship. And then this morning, among this group of people who are usually incredibly well behaved, who come into church and then mostly fall asleep and snore through morning prayer, one or two of them joining us from time to time, somebody came in who was really deeply disturbed and started to make a lot of noise, and it all kicked off at the back of the church. And one of the homeless men who was being berated because he was black, because he was asleep in church, and the person who berated him said, "I'm a proper Christian. You ought to get off your backside and go back to your own country, you black..." And this man stayed very, very calm and said to me afterwards, "Actually, I'm really sorry, but I did cause that because I saw that she was looking at the prayers that people had put on the prayer board, and she was just opening them to read, and I felt that they were there. They were private. People had folded them down and pinned them there. And I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to trigger that, but I just wanted to say to her she needed to be respectful of other people's prayers." So I think what happens is that there are a community of people there who do have a sense of church and worship and who do actually contribute in big ways. And then the last thing I want to say, of course, the real gift of homeless people to the St Martin in the Fields community is that it allows all of us to acknowledge that we too are people with needs, that life doesn't add up completely, probably for any of us, and that the presence of people who are so visibly in need makes it much, much easier for the rest of us to belong to a community where our own needs can be stated more clearly. And it seems to me that's the defining mark of the congregation at St Martin's, that we're people, and the people who stay there are people who know either that from their own experience or very close second-hand experience, their own vulnerability.
Thank you very much indeed. You commented during your splendid talk that you were told about this lecture about a year ago. These things don't just happen, they are planned a year ago or a year or more ago. And when Tim Connell and Barbara Anderson and I were looking at this series of lectures on London After Dark, we couldn't have imagined that you would have encapsulated everything in such a wonderful way at the moment. You have actually really given us a fantastic insight into a part of London which over the last 4 weeks we've become interested in, but suddenly there are real people there, there are real problems in London, there are problems being solved, and you've told us about those. And you told us about them in a wonderful way, because you talked about the darkness in a light way. And it's very, very difficult to achieve this. And I think by being somewhat light-hearted about this, you've made much more impact, I think, than you actually would have done if you stood up and said everything is bad. There are things that are good. So I want to thank you very, very much indeed on behalf of all of us for an absolutely splendid talk. Those of us who have heard you on Sunday mornings and various other times, and sometimes late at night, get about 10 or 15 minutes of you. We've had 45 minutes today. It's been a privilege. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.